And because I guess, when she was emotional, the woman was speaking louder than she intended to. And I heard her say roti.
Hmm.
And in the South Asian, as most people probably know, right? Like naan roti, that's bread. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, she's talking about her husband. Something's going on. There's
Oh.
there's something. I just made this assumption.
Hi, everyone. The following is my conversation with Jyoti Singh, Executive Director at Nelly's in Toronto. Nelly's provides programs and services to women and children who are facing violence, poverty, and homelessness. And I wanted to bring Jyoti on to discuss the impacts of inflation and the rising cost of living on the program and service offerings of Nelly's. Often we hear about inflation, but we don't hear about the impact it's having on the not-for-profit sector. Jyoti shared with me many of the stories at Nelly's. I'll leave links below to Nelly's and how you can get involved. But without further ado, here's my conversation with Jyoti Singh. Jyoti, thank you so much for joining me here on the Open Minds podcast, a new rebrand for me. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
I'm so fascinated by the work that Nelly's is doing. But before we get into any of that, I want to know more about you and how you kind of came into this space.
I've always had a passion for community work and wanting to give back. I am the product of immigrant parents. They immigrated to Canada in the 70s, and I was born here. And my experience just kind of growing up in my family and watching my parents and their struggles, and I think instilled in me just a great sense of community and wanting to help back, and always had this thing in my mind, about justice and fairness and how come there's not equality and so on. And so going into social services was kind of it was just kind of natural for me. It's where my heart was. My parents were also entrepreneurs, owning small businesses. So I also have that in my career. My husband and I, we've started small businesses, and but my passion has always been social services. So that's how I've always been involved in homeless services, community advocacy, and working with women, racialized women in particular. And my career has led me to this point where I am very, very lucky to be at Nelly's, to try to contribute however I can to helping the lives of women and children be better.
Nelly's has a very specific mission, specific vision, and very much unlike other not-for-profit groups working in this space, in that it's focused specifically on women and children. Certainly not only just women and children, but that's the main beneficiaries of your services. I just want to ask why Nelly's, because Nelly's is quite a fascinating organization.
Nelly's has an amazing history. Next year is our 50th anniversary, which we're very excited about. Celebrating. It has a long history and has gotten to the point of choosing to help women and children move forward, especially those that have experienced violence and abuse. Nelly's actually started out helping younger girls who were pregnant, and just through an evolution of seeing what the need was in the community has evolved to what it is today. I would say in terms of bed space, we're the third largest VAW, gender-based violence shelter in Toronto. We have 26 beds funded by the province and 12 beds that are funded by the city. And we're unique because I believe we're the only there's only two of us that service both violence against women and children. So, and our 12 beds with the city is specifically for homeless women. So we have hybrid. For myself personally, back in the early 2000s, there was an instance in my family where there was there was abuse and violence, and I was not there, and I felt a lot of guilt for that. And back
Mm.
then, I just felt like I don't know what I can do, how I can contribute, how I can um, do something for prevention. I just needed to do something. And funnily enough, I joined Nellie's board
Oh.
back in 2000s. I was not a good board member. I didn't last very long. I had young kids at home, and I did not contribute the way I had wanted to, and I left the board within a year.
Mm.
But then you fast forward about, I'd say, 18 years, and here I am now, the executive director of Nellie's. So I'm just pleased that I can contribute, maybe in a different way, not on the board, but to help bring Nellie's into its new future. So I think Nellie's has got a great history. It's well known. It's well known for being at the forefront on advocacy on so many different issues. And I'm just proud to be here with them.
That's fascinating, and good on you to kind of take that reflection. Not a lot of people do. I certainly don't, and I know a lot of other people don't. So good on you. I wanted to talk about the mission statement of Nellie's. Actually, before I do, you mentioned that there are 26 and 12 beds. I want to ask you, for those that are less aware, what's the average duration of stay for women and children who access Nellie's services?
So I would say that we're deemed a crisis shelter. And the definition of that is 3 months. But the reality is that it's not always necessary to help somebody stabilize and get out of that crisis mode within 3 months.
Mm.
So I would say our average stay is probably about 9 months.
Wow.
Even though we're remanded for 3 months, our average stay is probably about 9 months, just because we need to make sure that that woman is ready to move on, and we do not want to force them ahead of time. And I have to say that that stay, that criteria of 3 months comes from, I would say, the ministry, in terms of us being, so MCCSS, the provincial body that funds us. I would say that that's the criteria, but they're quite excellent. They don't hold us to that. They understand that although that is a goal, that it's not always possible, and that we're dealing with a lot of complex issues. So even though that's kind of the criteria that's set, the reality is very much different.
I can imagine that for Nellie's staff, yourself as well, volunteers, it must be very challenging when it's that 8 to 9 month mark for the woman in the family, and just to wonder about what's going to happen or what might happen. That must be so challenging. I can't imagine what an emotional roller coaster that must be.
I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit more like a celebration.
Oh,
we're really happy when women move on.
okay.
And some stay in touch, and some don't. And we kind of have to move on. But when they're leaving, it's a celebration, because they're going into their next chapter in life, and moving forward. So I think we often see it as a really positive thing. And I have to give kudos to our staff, less so myself, because I get to sit in my office and do all of like the policy and the networking and and what needs to be done in terms of operations, risk, financial, and so on. But the staff that on a day-to-day basis work with those women and children, the challenges doesn't stop at intake, right? When they come in and tell the story, the staff often get vicarious trauma. They're also affected by it. And I was recently reminded of this, if you don't mind me telling the story.
Of course.
I left the house. I was walking with my dog, and across the street from my house is a school. And I saw two women walking, and one was crying. And from a distance, it looked like one was much older than the other one. And I thought, oh, something's going on. I'm going to go the other way so I don't disturb them. And I did. I walked my dog around the side of the school, what have you. And then I was coming back, and they were quite a distance away, like quite far away. I'd say like maybe 500 meters or something. But I heard one word. And because I guess, when she was emotional, the woman was speaking louder than she intended to. And I heard her say roti.
Mm.
And in the South Asian, as most people probably know, right? Like naan roti, that's bread. And I'm like, oh, she's talking about her husband. Something's going on. There's there's something. I just made this assumption.
Wow.
So I went back to the house, dropped off my dog. I went and I got my business card. And by the time I came out, the women were walking away. One was going one way and the other one was going the other. And I stopped her and I said, listen, I don't want to get involved. But I heard, like I could see that you were really upset. Here's my card. I work for Nellie's. We're a not-for-profit. We help women and children that are experiencing violence and abuse. And I don't know your situation, but if you ever need help, please give me a call. I've given you my personal cell phone number. I live right there. And, if I can connect you with some services, would be more than happy to. And she says, well, I can see you're ready for work, but let me just tell you really quickly about what's going on. So, which doesn't, not everyone's able to do that, but
Sure.
She was really, really in a bad situation.
Oh.
And she went on to tell me exactly where she lived in this big, beautiful house. I know exactly which house it was. Backs onto a lake, man-made lake, beautiful, and it really started me thinking, like, all of these houses around me, we really don't know what's going on inside.
Wow.
And she was telling me, my kids, I can't leave my kids. I was telling me, there's shelters, you need to go. She's like, my husband, he cheats on me. He's constantly physically and verbally abusing me. And I can't leave and I need to leave. Like, I just don't, I can't. And I said, well, why can't you leave? And she said, well, my kids, I can't leave my kids. I can't not be with my kids. And I said, well, shelters, you can take your kids with you. And she said, oh, well, my kids are older. One's married and one's in university. And I'm like, well, then you can go. Like, they're not going to, nobody can stop you from seeing your kids. And she was just like, she wasn't able to get to that point, and then she started telling me that he actually had burned her with an iron, a clothing iron. So it was really devastating. And I was really affected that day. I had a really bad day. And I spoke to actually one of my staff members and she's like, and I was like, I need to be better with my staff. I need to be more compassionate. I need to remember that they hear these stories every day. And I just heard it today and it has completely ruined my day. And one of the things she's pointed out is like, you were out for a walk. You didn't expect to be confronted. So there's a situational thing. Sure. But we're surrounded by this. So sorry for this very long-winded answer, but I have to give kudos to my staff. And that's why it's a celebration when they leave. In some ways, some people say leaving is easy. It is not easy. And they say in some ways it's the easiest thing to do. It is not easy to leave. It's probably not the easiest thing to do, but it's the beginning of a really, really hard journey. Because when you leave, you're leaving everything. Oftentimes, culturally, you're leaving your social circle. You could be leaving your kids. You're not only leaving your in-laws, but your own family, parents and siblings may not be supporting the decision. That woman I encountered, her daughter actually told her mom, don't call the police. I don't want to see my dad go into jail. Like an adult daughter that, so there's so many different factors. So leaving is really difficult, but that's just the beginning. The journey afterwards is so uncertain that's what's really scary. And so when we know that a woman is leaving us and hopefully going into her own housing, whether it's with herself, like by herself or with her kids, it's a celebration because it's still going to be hard, but they got over the big hump.
Yeah.
So it's great when they move on. We love it.
And knowing that Nellie's is there and knowing the services that Nellie's has may provide them at least some level of, I know I can pick up the phone and call the staff member at Nellie's that was really supportive, really helped me. So perhaps that's also a legacy. I'm sure that Nellie's has many cases where, a previous client calls months later and says, thank you so much, or I'm going through something now. That is so
Definitely.
fascinating.
And that's why Nellie's also has community programs.
Right.
So, that we can refer them to our food bank, that we help people with housing in the community. We help with eviction prevention as well. And you're absolutely right. We have women. I've only been at Nellie's for 2.5 years, and I know of one woman that had gone through abuse earlier in her life and had come back to us.
Wow.
So we do see people again. But even more devastating is that we're starting to see the next generation. So people that had come to us with abuse, and now their kids are coming back.
Oh,
So it's
geez.
really difficult to break that cycle of violence. But services like Nellie's, we're not the only one, but all of these shelters, all of these services that help in gender-based violence are so important. They are so needed, and we need to continue to support this sector, because the impact is intergenerational and it continues.
So, Jyoti, I have a few questions for you. Why? And this is so fascinating. My mind is going a mile a minute as I hear you speak. I can't imagine. I can't believe that you made that linkage too when she said roti. Like that is such a linkage to make. I would not have made that linkage. So good on you. When I open the news, I'm littered with car crashes and murders and homicides and train derailments or what have you. When it comes to domestic violence, when it comes to sexual assaults, I don't hear nearly as much. Last year, I did a podcast with Shane Vidiata at Free Them, talks about sex work and child exploitation. But we had this great conversation about how gender-based violence goes so underreported and unreported completely in our news. And that leads me to think that the public consciousness around gender-based violence, violence against women, is absent. And when it's out of sight, it's out of mind. I'm sure you see this. I'm sure you feel this as well. How can we kind of put this back on the forefront of Canadians and people writ large to help them understand that this is actually a big deal in our society?
It is, and it's such a challenge. And to be very honest, for your listeners, I even though, because I live it every day, right? Like I go to work and I know what I'm doing, even I forget how prevalent it is. And that story I told you about that woman was a perfect example. I was so affected, and I live in a very nice, some well-established community. I mean, I'm surrounded with immigrants, but where I live, it's mostly immigrants that have been here for 15, 20, 30 years. That woman had been here for 23 years.
Wow.
So even I forget. And it really starts now when I walk around my neighborhood. I actually get this glimpse of like, what's going on in these houses? Like, we actually don't know. They look very nice and manicured outside, but we don't really know what's going in. And chances are, your listeners, there's somebody on your street that is going through some kind of abuse and violence. It's a very difficult question. It's hard to create awareness of something that people don't want to talk about. Oftentimes culturally and societally, women don't want to talk about it. And it's not a matter of being an immigrant or your level of education. If anything, probably the more affluent you are, the more educated you are, you don't want people to know that you're in that situation.
Right.
So it gets very difficult to bring it to the forefront. COVID brought it to the forefront for a bit. There was a lot of reports on how women now were trapped with abusers. Not even women, men too. I want to be careful,
Sure.
That people were trapped with their abusers and they couldn't get out. So that definitely helped. We had some good flow of money at that point. I really don't have an answer for you other than the fact that we continue to need the support in this sector to raise the awareness and to get to people. The most difficult thing is the news reports when there's an incident.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of incidents of femicide. a lot in the news lately. And so I feel like we're hearing it more like the past few months than we have, but it gets to the forefront when somebody dies. And that's what we need to change.
Yeah.
And I can tell you at Nellie's right now, where our senior management mind is going is that I remember 20 years ago, when I was entering the sector of social services, not even just gender-based violence, but social services in general, I would remember hearing people say, oh, we need to work ourselves out of a job. And we have not, and we cannot. Part of it is that poverty and these societal ills or challenges are also moneymakers, right?
Yeah.
And it becomes a business. So, but we tend to be putting our money into crisis and Band-Aid solutions, which is exactly where Nellie's is, right? Like our main operations is a crisis shelter. Absolutely, there's a place for that. But we really need to start thinking about prevention.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where Nellie's wants to go. We've got some exciting programs on that we're implementing. So one is called Rock and Water, where we're working with kids. We're realizing that to break this cycle of violence, and we're getting the next generation coming back. If we really want to make an impact, we have to stem the tide.
Right.
So we've decided to do, we went to the UK and got trained in this program called Rock and Water, which works with kids on setting boundaries and how to communicate. So, it works specifically with kids, and it can help with when they're seeing when they're witnessing violence, but it can also help when they're being bullied and how to manage that. And also to kind of look within themselves. Am I being oppressive towards somebody else? Why am I upset, and how do I regulate myself, and how do I react in this situation?
Gotcha.
So that's one thing that we're working on in terms of prevention and trying to break a cycle of violence and give the younger generation the tools that they need to maybe make different choices. In addition to that,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
So in addition to that, we're also implementing a program. We have gone and gotten trained on empowerment self-defense. And so we're working with with two organizations, Empowerment Self-Defense Global and PAVE Prevention. So PAVE is part of Empowerment Self-Defense Global. So and when people hear self-defense, they're thinking like just violence, which that's not what it is. There is a component where we teach women how to defend themselves, but it's just one component of 5. So, we talk about our brain and how we're reacting. We're talking about the amygdala, and we're talking about the vagus nerve and how we're reacting to something and what are our other options. So, so there's 5 components to it. There's think, there's yell, run, fight, and tell. And tell is always the thumb, because you always, whatever you do, you need to tell somebody what happened. And so, we go through all of those things, and you need to go through all of your options before you get to the point of fight. And it's not that we're not going to be looking to tell women to be violent, but to be able to defend yourself enough so you can get away. So that's something that we're just starting to roll out. That's really interesting. There's some pushback on that because, we're a violence against women organization, and some may believe that we're perpetuating violence, but a lot of it has to do around communication and looking at your different options. And I think that came out because of COVID. Because we couldn't reach the women and they felt isolated and they didn't have the skills and resources available to them. So we want to start looking at what we can do in terms of prevention or providing them with things that already reside within themselves so that they are maybe better able to handle situations that they're experiencing. And I think that's where the conversation needs to go.
Yeah.
And that's when we have that conversation and we provide those skills to everyone, not just people experiencing violence, the awareness will grow and more people will start thinking about it, because violence is in very different forms.
Yeah.
They're microaggressions.
100%.
And that's really what self-defense, like empowerment self-defense is about, is recognizing those things.
I think that there should be a distinction that people should make between self-defense and violence. Like I can't see how it could be equated that self-defense promotes violence. I don't know. I'm not a jujitsu expert at all, but I believe that jujitsu teaches you, if somebody does violate you physically, that you are prepared in that instance. So to me, violence is not something it perpetuates. It's self-defense. It's understanding the body and how it works and defending yourself against a potential attacker. So I just don't think that those two words, violence and self-defense, should be conflated. I wanted to ask you about a few things. One, and this has been a thought that I've always had. I know I brought you on to talk about inflation, but before we get there, I always think about the things that I've benefited from in my life that was no asking by me. And one was, having really strong parents as role models, and the thought of ever, even raising my voice or the thought of violence against a woman just never crossed my mind. And I'm sure there are many men like me who are just flabbergasted that men would do these things. They can't understand how this could possibly happen. And so I think, much like other topics I've covered on this podcast, one thing perhaps we could do, or I'd love to know your opinion on this, is do some outreach to young men in particular, or men more broadly, about how to, undertake anger management, mental health and awareness, how to channel their anger in an appropriate way. It's okay to be angry, but how you channel that is very important. And help them understand that there are devastating impacts to your children, your family. It ripples out. Has Nellie's kind of broached that? And I'm sure that topic has been raised, but again, as a man myself, it just blows my mind that there are so many men that struggle with this and that engage in this type of behavior.
Yeah, this is something that we talk about often, and to be very honest, Nellie's has not gone that route. But and that's a conscious decision from our board. We have a community board that governs us, and so that has been a decision from the leadership. But what we have done, because I am concerned exactly about what you're talking about. And that's part of the reason why we engaged in Rock and Water. And right. I think that's one of the ways we can do it. And we are going to do it from the point of the younger generation. So Rock and Water right now, we're rolling it out in sports teams. And we're trying to do a lot of it before school starts. Because great. A lot of it plays out on the schoolyard. And so we feel like, all of that bullying and all of that, oftentimes we reflect what we're experiencing, and it's all about like power and oppression, and who has the power and who's oppressing who. And then to go out into a different environment and saying, okay, maybe I know now how to take on some power, because and I think that's really what violence is about power and oppression. And it's about trauma. So I really believe strongly that we need to break the cycle. And so from Nellie's perspective, we haven't been doing it with men, but we are looking at doing it at the younger generation. The other challenge we have is that in women's shelters, we tend, and with good reason, to hire only women, especially when women are coming in with abuse. There can be fear of men and so on. But the challenge that happens is that the kids in the shelter are not all female, and that they're male. And so they've had one role model where they've seen abusing their mother, and they may not have another positive role model. And then they come to a shelter and there's still no positive role model. So that's a challenge that we have, and we need to figure out how to overcome that. And we're hoping Rock and Water is going to be one of the ways to do that. But it's a big, long thing. And I'm right now, I think Nellie's is all about like, how do we get in there and stop that cycle?
I'd love to know, and I'm sure we'll keep in touch. But I'd love to know the early results of Rock and Water, because it sounds like a very fascinating project, and I'm so fascinated to hear what other people say about it. I want to chat with you about inflation. Over the past few years, with COVID, it's probably been really challenging, although Nellie's has had some really big successes over the past few years. But one thing I want to ask you is with regards to COVID, inflation, and the cost of living, what specific challenges has Nelly seen? Because I can imagine that staffing, for one, is a big issue. I can imagine that there are growing requests. Your just costs of your daily costs for running Nelly's has grown. So, can you help walk us through how the cost of living and inflation and COVID have affected Nelly's, both maybe positively and negatively?
Well, let me go back to some of the wins we had. So
Sure.
it was identified a few years ago that Nellie's was in desperate need of a new shelter.
Yeah.
Our old shelter, we're in a new shelter right now, and we completed that construction during COVID. Unfortunately, our construction didn't complete before COVID because it was exactly the reason why we needed a new shelter. Our old shelter had 8 rooms and we housed 36 women and children. And we had 3 bathrooms that they had to share. So it was no surprise when Nellie's was the first VAW shelter to have an outbreak.
Wow.
And I had only been the ED there for about 6 weeks. So it was like, holy geez, you know?
Yeah.
And so we just moved into our new shelter February of this year, 2022, and it has made all the difference in the world. But with that shelter came our costs were inflated, became inflated with construction. I'm sure a lot of people out there know hard to get trades, hard to get supplies. Yeah. The supplies jumped. So it ended up costing us quite a bit more than we anticipated. And the move-in date was constantly changed and delayed. And now we're in there and we are dealing with, repairs, with every new building, that there's a lot of deficiencies, and we're learning things about this building. We still don't fully understand the costs. I've told our board that it's going to take us it's not until the 3rd year that we'll really understand what our costs are. But there are a lot of surprise costs that are coming up. Inflation definitely is not helping. We have been so lucky with the community the past 2 years, because at a time when agencies literally were struggling to raise funds, and some have actually had to close their doors, we actually had unbelievable support from the community during COVID.
Amazing.
And we actually surpassed our fund development goals, which was a beautiful surprise.
Wow.
This year has been going well, but we're really concerned because every Canadian is really affected. And when you're affected in terms of your pocketbook for your cost of living of basic things, gas, groceries, and then all of your utilities, it's very difficult to think about others and to give back when you're struggling yourself. So we are concerned, not only are our costs going up, but the donations and the kindness of our community that we so rely on, we understandably we foresee is going to reduce. So I don't know what's going to happen. And all I know is that we will continue to work and strive and do what we need to do. The really sad thing is that our staff are also seeing those rising costs, and their incomes are not keeping up with it. And it's getting really, really stressful. So it affects everything. It affects our operations, but it affects the personal life of our staff who are servicing the women that may not be able to do the best job that they need to do because they have their own stressors in life. So it's this ripple effect that's affecting us, and we're not exactly sure how that's going to play out. Our cost of food has gone up. We've just increased up until last month. We only had 36 beds. We negotiated with the city to add 2 more beds, which provides us with a little bit more money. But the money that we get per diem for those beds does not cost all of the increase. And oftentimes, even though the province funds us for 26 beds, if we have a woman with 2 children and that takes us to 28 beds, we have the bed space, we do it, right? So we really try hard not to turn people away. And I can tell you, Nellie's has always been full. Like even throughout the pandemic, We did not. The only reason why we would have empty beds is because we would need it for social distancing or for isolation. Otherwise, every single bed was full, and we even had a hotel site. Very thankful to the province for funding that. The government was great.
Hmm.
All levels of the government was great during COVID. I was so pleasantly surprised and shocked, and give them kudos for that. And they're
Yeah.
still doing a really great job in supporting us. But the need is there. We do not have a single bed that's empty today at Nellie's. We're fully booked.
Wow. And
And we're turning people away.
wow. And that the quagmire in all of this is we don't know how long inflation will last. We don't know how long this will continue. And it just has rippling effects, not just for staffing and keeping staff. Costs are going up. And as you mentioned, it's hard to predict the fundraising. So it's fascinating looking at Nellie's financial reports for the past few years, because the fundraising has been incredible, has been really good. But it's hard in your position to predict the next 5 years out, because as inflation goes up, I can see, and this is just me thinking, like people will start rethinking their charitable donations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, we need to think about it too. If anything, Nellie's is expanding right now. We had 7 job openings up, and we're having a hard time finding people. And that's happening in a lot of sectors, and it's definitely happening in ours. We have some great partnerships. I'd like to give a shout out to my fellow ED at the Redwood, who shared some staff with us.
Amazing.
She's, Abby, the executive director there, she and I work really well together. And really, we can't do this work in silos. We really need to do it together. And I'll tell her, oh, I've got like the supervisor position and I can't fill it. And she'll be like, Jyoti, I've got some really great staff and I don't have a supervisor position. And they're going to leave. And rather than leave the sector, I'd rather them stay in the sector. So I've got somebody I can recommend to you. And I'm always telling her, Abby, don't affect your own operations. And her own managers will be like, Abby, you need to stop giving our staff to Nell. It's like, you need to stop this. And she's like, look, no, we need to do it for the better of the sector. And she's a gem of a person. I really encourage you to speak with her as well if you want to learn more about the VAW sector, because the Redwood is doing some really amazing work, some interesting stuff, and we're partnering, but they're doing some stuff that's different than us. And she's got this beautiful perspective, and nobody does that. I'm telling you, at a time when there's such a huge labor crunch, nobody's like, here, take this amazing staff that's been with me for 3 years and interview them for a supervisor position, because I don't want them to leave. Right. So those
that's
partnerships
incredible.
are so important. And I'm like, I wish I could offer you something else. I could offer something back, but I don't have anything. But that's really how we're going to get through this, is through partnerships, creativity, and innovation. And I think, and that's part of the reason, like, Nellie's is growing, because we're diversifying our funding. One of the things that I've talked to, our staff team about, and the board, is that we need to diversify the funding. We cannot only rely on our 2 major funders, and we have the United Way, which is great for our community programming. And then the rest of it is on our funders. Prior to this new building and prior to COVID, we had a shortfall of about 600 to 700,000 in our budget every year. That was the target that we had to raise. With the new shelter, we've raised that target to 950,000.
Wow.
So that's the estimate. But now that we're in there and we're looking at it, we need to increase, because the building is so much bigger. We need to increase the staffing, and we're already bursting at the seams in our new building. We actually think that we need to raise about 1.3. That's the gap now. And I'm not sure how we're going to do it other than diversify funding, which means more work, more staff, more programs. But we are starting to look at social enterprises, and we're hoping the empowerment self-defense will be something where we can train women that can then go out and offer this training to corporations and provide empowerment sessions in workplaces, so that you can address, so that you're not getting to a point where a woman, or anybody actually, men even, are being harassed at work and don't know how to deal with it.
Right.
like to be able to set your own verbal boundaries and start, creating respectful workplaces. So that's one thing that's on the horizon for Nelly's. We're hoping way down the road, but a possible vision is to start a social enterprise which will provide meaningful work for women with a livable wage. But if and when it ever does provide profit, could then also feed back into Nelly's shelter operations to help with those expenses. And I think those are the things that we kind of need to do. We need to start looking at some business models and having
It's okay.
having a hybrid model
Yeah.
between not-for-profit and the work we do.
So I have many friends who work in government, private sector. One thing I notice is that not many of my friends work in the not-for-profit sector. And I feel like the not-for-profit sector is business 101. You learn everything about how a business operates. But to me, I think that the potential beauty of the not-for-profit sector is that it will ingrain in you, if you are in that role, to fundraise and sell. I mean, I think those are such critical skills that can be applied in any job, in any sector. Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the fundraising? Because I do think that that's kind of like another area that a lot of people are less familiar with. They're less familiar with how organizations that like Nelly's, that's doing such incredible work with women and children, how the fundraising is happening. Because I can imagine that it's not. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's not a tough sell. But for many, it very well might be to donate to Nelly's.
Yeah, especially when they have this struggle right now. It can be a tough step. We're very lucky. Our director of fund development is stellar. She is amazing. And has done a great job. And, when I actually take some time and go into schools and do some presentations in civic classes, it allows me get back to my front line kind of roots and hopefully inspire the younger generation. And what I tell them is that, our job, like any job really, but in social services, it's all about human interaction.
Yeah.
That's all it is relating with people. And I think our director of fund development, who heads up all of our fundraising and fund development, is excellent at that. She knows how to make those relations. She knows how to keep people engaged, and she tells the stories. And I think that's really the important thing is once people know the work we're doing and how we're helping, they naturally want to give, or at least we're someplace in their mindset, and they might not give today or tomorrow. They might give 5-10 years down the road, whenever they're able to afford it. But I think the approach for us in fund development is just sharing our work.
Yeah.
And we've just been lucky people have responded to us. We don't do a lot of events ourselves. We've been really lucky. We have a lot of third-party events. And yesterday somebody just called me and they're like, we're about to do an event and we want to donate the funds to delis and we just want permission to use your logo and so on. Wow. And so I'm always shocked because they mistakenly called me instead. And I'm like, okay, here's Ingrid's email and her phone number. Please give her a call. So we're very lucky that way. And it's really those third-party events, while we don't do them because it takes so much resources and time, they're really important because that's what keeps our stories out in the community.
Yeah, that is truly fascinating. I'd love to have a chat with Ingrid just to learn a little bit about, how she's able to.
I would be more than happy to share her email with you, and we can set that up.
That would be great. Thanks, Jyoti. That's incredible. I wanted to chat with you. I know we don't have too much time left. I want to chat with you about the just astronomical increase in housing over the past few years here in the city of Toronto. My friends and I, it's just a routine. I'm sure everyone's talking about. It's just rents are going up dramatically. If you want to buy something, it's further and further out of reach. And the cost of living is going up, and salaries are not going up. They're not keeping pace. For the middle class, they're feeling this. For those that are low income families, they're being completely decimated by by this rising cost in Toronto, especially in Canada's big cities. How has this impact affected Nelly's? Because I can imagine that Nelly's also has to pay higher, as you mentioned, construction costs, but also higher rents, higher lease agreements, all that. And that really kind of takes away from the services, or can take away from the services. So I wanted to, because I think when we talk housing and we talk about inflation and cost of living, we don't talk about the not-for-profit sector and the impact that it's truly having. What do you see as real costs and barriers with this, but also potential new opportunities for Nelly's in this high inflationary environment?
You know, that's the thing about not-for-profits. We may not be talking about it, but there's a reason why the government diversifies, gives this work to not-for-profits.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, they
Right.
know that they can do it cheaper and they'll do it more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, right?
Yeah.
And we are seeing these inflationary increases, and we're managing them the best we can. Nelly's is very fortunate with our community support and that continued support that we've had. So, and it speaks really to the history of Nelly's, the work that it's done historically, and it speaks to the good work of our staff. I've only been there for 2.5 years. This is a legacy that I adopted, and really doesn't have to do with me. It has to do with the generations of work that's been done at Nelly's. But in terms of inflation, like I said, it's not going to be until the third year that we really understand our expenses, which is really scary at a time when inflation has gone up.
Yeah.
We are managing the best we can in terms of our own expenses, but when it comes to services, so that's the problem. The demand for our services go up, and the money is going down. But as a not-for-profit, it's really difficult, and that's the difference between the for-profit and not-for-profit, right? We cannot overpromise and under-deliver, and oftentimes and not to throw anybody under the bus, but right now that's kind of what we're seeing in the transportation industry, right? Where they're selling vacations and tickets, but they're not able to fulfill that mandate. And with us, it's kind of the opposite. We've had to figure out there's an even greater demand for our food program. And we had a cap at our food program of about 60, but given the greater need and what's happening in the community right now, we've increased it to 75. No increase in funds, no increase necessarily in food that's coming through. We just had to reallocate resources. And you start making decisions on, do we serve less people or do we serve more with less?
Yeah.
And so then you have to start looking at, like, what are our choices here, and how do we do this? It's never an option to be able to do less with less. We're always striving to do more with what we have or with less. And it's kind of counterintuitive from that business mindset, right?
Yeah.
More profit, like let's increase the business.
Yeah.
For us, it's like greater need, not more money, but we need to find a way to do even more.
It's interesting that you say that, because, I've got friends who are MBA grads, and a lot of them, they want to go into the big four accounting consulting firms. And one experience I've had working with one, and I'm not going to name names or anything like that, but it was that, when you're part of these large companies, they've got so many different projects going on that one project that may not necessarily be the big, winner for that partner, they don't give as much attention. They don't provide you as much services because they know they're going to get paid every quarter or however much. That's not the case in the not-for-profit sector. You cannot, like you say, overpromise and underdeliver. You cannot. You have to deliver. And I think that for MBA grads, perhaps the start to your career should be in the not-for-profit sector, where your feet are to the fire, and you have to learn every aspect of business development and product delivery. There's no other sector, I think, where product delivery is as critical and as timely as the not-for-profit sector. I mean, this has a real impact on people's lives. And so I just think that MBA school should like kind of flip the script a little bit and say, if you really want to develop these core skills in a very short period of time, there's nothing better than a not-for-profit sector and an organization that's doing all of the things. And you go into these big organizations and you just may not get any of that experience in your first few years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. Because sometimes sometimes we're working with life and death, like
Yeah.
if the support is there or not.
Yeah.
And so you can't always be so lax. Like
Yeah.
you need everybody on point. And I think that's really the biggest challenge. Like I really do worry about our staff, like
Yeah.
because their services are so critical. And if they're not present because they have to worry about their own expenses and all the challenges that they're also facing,
Yeah.
it is definitely going to be impacting services.
Sure.
But, people that choose to work in the social service field they're resilient.
Yeah.
There's a reason why they're there, right?
Yeah.
So I shouldn't worry too much, but but that's kind of, it's the reality of what's happening right now.
I 100% agree. I think people who work in the social service space are very passionate. They're there, like you say, for a reason. They may have a personal connection, may not, but they're there because they see the need and they want to help in any way they possibly can. Jyoti, before I let you go, I want to ask you about a large donor. So great to see that the city and the province is stepping up, especially with all the political changes we've seen over the past few years here in Ontario, that Nellie's has benefited from that. Going forward, let's say 5 to 10 years with, who knows, the political waters change so frequently, it seems. How can large donors continue to help Nellie's expand, do more, potentially even do the business model idea that you had mentioned in this podcast, and make it less political? That's one thing I also find. I find that when it comes to these topics, it gets very political, and it shouldn't. It should be focusing on the need that is there, regardless of your opinion on it. So how can large donors help Nellie's 5-10 years down the line?
I would say get engaged,
Yeah.
So one of the challenges we've had that our director of fund development has been quite successful at, but it's a constant sell, I guess, for her, is that while we do appreciate donation of items, it restricts us in some ways. So I'll give you an example. Once we put out, this was before my time, a call for diapers, because we really needed diapers. We had a lot of kids but then people just send diapers, and the call somehow went international, and we got so many diapers, we couldn't even house them.
Wow.
And then the sizes aren't right, because a lot of people tend to send the small sizes, but we need the bigger ones. And then there's this disconnect. So one thing for donors to, and just not for Nellie's, for anybody looking to donate, research the agency that you're looking at donating. And, a good department of fund development will be more than happy to field those calls. And make sure you feel comfortable with them, because as much as we appreciate the supplies, being able to receive gift cards or cash is much more effective, because then we can buy what is actually needed rather than in-kind donations. So that's one thing. If there's a policy to have like staff donate and then donate it someplace, while it's very much appreciated, the cash it allows us to be more flexible in the needs of our clients. Wow. And the other thing is that think about things of like, we're often trying to recruit for our boards. We need especially diversity on our boards, and not just in skills, but in different cultures and ethnicities. And that's another way that an agency can give back. Just, that if their employee is like, maybe a finance expert and a woman of color or something, and they say, I'd like to donate some time to Nellie's. And then a company can also give back by saying, okay, you can consider this as part of your work time and our social good of giving back, right? So there's other ways,
Right.
whether you're large or small. And then we have committees too. We've got our social justice and accessibility committee that we just recruited for. So to have people in the community that volunteer in that way to help us deal with the policy and advocacy issues that we need to. That's another way to give back.
Right.
If you know an agency well and you've donated to them, you should be able to ask if there's a way that, and the answer might be no. I know at Nellie's, we've done this. If they can have a very private, quick tour of the shelter so they can see and have some impact on how the funds are being used. And we've done that with some of our long-term donors, had them come through the shelter. We tried to do it especially before the women moved in so that they can maintain their privacy. But even after they've moved in, we can do it. We just inform them that we're going to be having, 2 people come through on a quick tour, and then the women know whether they want to stay in their rooms or not. We don't really interfere.
Yeah.
But, and then the last thing I would say is that call and ask the director of fund development, what do you need the money for? And let them give you some ideas. Because if you're giving money, but you want to know how it's going to be used, you could pick and choose. So for instance, Ingrid right now is very excited about Rock and Water and our empowerment self-defense. So she will tell people about it and say, look, this is what we're doing. It's new. It's different. It's going to cost us money. We need to get like the MMA pads. We need to buy a lot of equipment. And then, for outreach, we don't have money for a coordinator yet. Right now, it's myself and a supervisor that are rolling it out. We're doing we're rolling up our sleeves and doing the frontline work on it. So, ask them, are there particular programs that are short in funds that you could donate to? And that helps us, right?
Yeah.
And then we can start, once those funds are in, then we can look at, okay, what other programs are there? Where should we be looking for funding and it or alleviate some pressure for us?
That is so fascinating. Yeah. Sorry,
Also, the last thing is when the money is not tied to anything, when we're in an inflationary crunch like we are right now, that is so helpful because if my utility bills are crazy high and I've got funds that are not tied to something, then I can put it towards that because funders don't tend to fund those kinds of things. They want to fund staffing and program costs, client costs, and so on. They're not really interested in helping to fund property tax and utilities, all those things that allow for those things to happen. So to have funds that are untied specifically to anything is very, very helpful for us.
I've always wondered that myself. You're not the first person, I'm not sure if you said this or not, but a lot of organizations I've spoken to is just the restrictiveness of some government funding, the application process. I worked with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, and computer literacy is a big issue in the North. And so applying may not even be an option for many communities. And I always thought, back in my head, why don't organizations just say, hey, here's our 5 to 10 year strat plan. This is it. And then the government ministries, different governments come in and say, okay, great, we're going to fund, this portion and that portion. Here you go. You said you needed, $3 million for this one thing. Here you go. And let the organization breathe, let them do their thing. I've always wondered, and then get out of the business of administration, because that can at times be a barrier.
Yeah, for sure.
But Jyoti, I can't thank you enough for shedding light on so many topics in our hour chat here. I'm sure that everyone who's listening has had their mind blown, like myself, about a lot of the challenges that Nellie's faces, as well as the reality of violence against women, gender-based violence. I can't thank you enough for sharing your stories and letting us know a little bit about the impacts of inflation, housing costs, cost of living on Nellie's especially, and finally to discuss innovative ways people who are looking to support Nellie's, how they can call Nellie's, find out what programs are happening, find out where some needs are. I think that's so fascinating. I think a lot of people just don't do that. Like you say, they show up with diapers or whatever, and they're not totally clear about what the needs are. So thanks again. I'm going to link everything in the show notes to Nellie's and to all the great work that Nellie's is doing. I'm so excited to learn about the programs. And I'm sure this is not a last conversation. I'm sure we're going to keep this conversation going. So thanks again. And thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Really appreciated the time.
Awesome.